She's not my daughter, my mother told the hostess at the front desk, laughing the way she always did when she wanted people to think she was charming. She's just the plus one I brought along. I was standing right beside her, 41 years old, in a blazer that cost more than my mother's monthly rent. The hostess smiled politely and looked at her clipboard. My mother kept talking, something about how she'd been a member of the Rideau Club for 15 years, how she knew the general manager personally, how the reservation was under her name and only her name. I stopped listening somewhere around the third sentence. I'd heard variations of this speech my whole life. What I hadn't expected was for the woman at the front desk to look at me, really look at me, and quietly ask if she could see my membership card. My mother laughed again. Oh, she's not a member. She's with me. I reached into my coat pocket and put my card on the desk. The hostess picked it up, read it once, looked up at me, read it again. Then she straightened her back, the way you do when you suddenly realize you've been speaking to the wrong person the entire time. Dr. Ellison, she said, we've been expecting you. Your table is ready. My mother stopped talking. I'd spent 37 years waiting for that silence. I need to go back a little, because if I just tell you the ending, you won't understand what it cost me to get there. I grew up in a small house in Nepean, which is the part of Ottawa that nobody from Toronto knows exists. My father worked for the federal government, mid-level civil servant, decent salary, no ambitions beyond paying the mortgage and watching hockey night in Canada on Saturdays. My mother was the ambitious one. Not for herself, exactly. More for the idea of herself. The version of herself she wanted to perform for other people. She joined every committee she could find. She volunteered at the right charity galas. She cultivated friendships with women who had larger houses and longer driveways. And she spent 30 years convinced that one day she was going to be invited to actually sit at the table she'd been orbiting her entire life. She had 2 children. My brother Cormac, who was 9 years older than me and could do no wrong. And me. I was the one who read too much. Who asked questions at dinner that made her uncomfortable. Who got a full scholarship to McGill at 17 and cried in the airport bathroom on the way to Montreal because I didn't know if I was happy or terrified or both. She told the neighbors I'd gotten a little grant. At McGill, I discovered that I was good at biochemistry in a way I hadn't known I was good at anything. My professor in second year, a sardonic woman from Winnipeg who had 0 patience for students who coasted, called me into her office after my midterm and said, "You know this is exceptional, right? You know what this means for where you could go?" I didn't. I genuinely didn't know. Nobody in my family had ever said a sentence like that to me before. I went to medical school. Then I did my residency in general surgery at the University of Toronto. Then I did a fellowship in hepatobiliary surgery, that's liver, pancreas, bile ducts, in Vancouver. I was 31 years old before I finally felt like I was standing on ground that was actually mine. My mother told people I was working in a hospital somewhere out west. I moved back to Ottawa at 32. By then I was on staff at the Ottawa Hospital, doing complex resections, training residents, leading a small research team. I bought a condo in Centretown. I drove a sensible car. I had a savings account that would have made my father weep with pride. And every single month, without fail, I transferred money to my mother's account. It started small. She'd mentioned, in passing, that the furnace was acting up. I sent her $800. A few months later, Cormac's truck needed repairs and he was in between things. I sent $2,200. Then there was a medical bill for my mother's knee surgery that her provincial coverage didn't fully absorb. Then there was a trip she wanted to take with her friend group because she couldn't bear to be the only one who didn't go. Then there was the kitchen renovation. Then Cormac's rent when he got evicted. Then. By the time I was 38, I calculated that I had sent my mother and brother a combined total of somewhere north of $130,000 over 6 years. I want to be precise about that number because people always say, well, surely someone smart enough to be a surgeon would have stopped after the first year. And what I want to say to those people is that you've never been a child who grew up invisible. You've never learned to buy the small warmth of being needed. I was not paying for their groceries. I was paying for the 3 seconds after the money arrived when my mother called me, and her voice was soft and she said, "Oh, sweetheart, thank you." That was the only version of my mother I had ever been able to afford. Cormac knew, of course, that I was sending money. He just didn't talk about it, because acknowledging it would have required acknowledging that he was taking it without ever once saying anything more than thanks. He worked seasonally. Something to do with landscaping, then something else with a friend's contracting business, and had what I can only describe as a rotating door of minor crises that always seemed to resolve as soon as money appeared. He'd gotten married a few years earlier to a woman named Felicity, who I genuinely liked in theory and found exhausting in practice. She had strong opinions about everything except the one thing I needed her to have opinions about, which was why her husband kept calling his surgeon sister every 4 months with a new emergency. They had a daughter named Bia who was 6 and had my father's eyes, and I loved her deeply, and she had nothing to do with any of this. What eventually broke me wasn't a single moment. It was a Tuesday evening in February, which is when most real things break, not in some dramatic confrontation, but in an ordinary moment that suddenly becomes unbearable. I had just finished a 9-hour surgery, a Whipple procedure, which is one of the most complex operations in abdominal surgery. You're removing the head of the pancreas and reconstructing the digestive tract, and it requires everything you have for every one of those 9 hours. I was sitting in the surgeon's lounge in my scrubs eating a granola bar because I hadn't eaten since 5 in the morning, and my phone rang. It was my mother. She didn't ask how I was. She said, "I need to talk to you about the Rideau Club gala." The Rideau Club is a private club in downtown Ottawa. Very old, very establishment, the kind of place where cabinet ministers and Supreme Court justices eat lunch. My mother had wanted to go to their annual charitable gala for as long as I could remember. She'd mentioned it every year like a prayer she kept offering up to no one in particular. "I've been invited," she said. "Margaret's husband is on the board and she got me a ticket. But I need a proper evening gown and the alterations, and I was thinking, since you never spend money on yourself." "Mom," I said. "It's not a lot. Maybe 1,500. The dress is on sale." I looked at my granola bar. I thought about the 9 hours I'd just spent with my hands inside a 63-year-old man's abdomen, trying to give him more time with his grandchildren. "I'll think about it," I said. Because I always said I'll think about it, and then I always sent the money, and nothing ever changed. But this time, on the drive home, something shifted. I don't know how else to say it. Something just stopped. I didn't send the money. Not that week. Not the next week. My mother called twice. Left a voicemail that started with, "I just want to make sure you got my message," and ended with something pointed about how she didn't ask for much. I called back and said I couldn't help this time, that things were tight, which was not true. Things were the opposite of tight. But I had to start somewhere. She didn't speak to me for 3 weeks. When she called again, she was breezy, as if the silence hadn't happened. She said she and Cormac and Felicity were going to the gala after all. Margaret had gotten Cormac a complimentary ticket through some connection, and wasn't that wonderful? She didn't say who had paid for the dress. She said I should come too, since it would be good for me to get out. I said I might stop by. What I didn't tell her was that I had been a donor to the gala's beneficiary foundation, the Ottawa Community Health Foundation, for 4 years, a significant donor. Not because I was trying to be impressive, but because I believed in what they did with the money, and because I'd watched enough patients come through the Ottawa hospital without adequate community support to know exactly where those gaps were. I had been invited to the gala in my own right. My name was on the invitation. I had a table reserved under my professional credentials, but my mother didn't know any of that, because my mother had never once asked me what I did with my time outside of being available to her. The night of the gala, I dressed carefully. I wore a dark green silk gown that I'd bought in Vancouver years ago and worn exactly once. I put on the earrings my father had given me when I graduated from medical school, simple gold, nothing showy. I drove downtown, found parking off Spark Street, and walked into the Rideau Club on my own. My mother was already at the front desk when I arrived. She was wearing the dress. It was a deep burgundy, and she looked beautiful in it, which is the thing about my mother that always made everything harder. She was with Cormac and Felicity and a woman I didn't recognize, and she was explaining to the hostess at the front desk that she was a guest of Margaret somebody, and she had a +1, and perhaps also her son and his wife. The hostess was politely working through the list. That was when I walked up beside her. "She's not my daughter," my mother said, and laughed. "I mean, she's just the +1 I brought along." She was talking to the hostess, but performing for the woman I didn't know, a status performance. The kind where you establish that you're somebody by casually diminishing the people around you. I'd seen her do it 100 times. I'd just never been the person she was diminishing in public before. Something locked in my chest. I reached into my coat and put my card on the desk. The hostess read it, looked up, "Read it again." "Dr. Ellison," she said. "We've been expecting you. Your table is ready." And, she paused, then smiled, "We have a note here that you're being acknowledged this evening, one of our top contributors to the foundation." My mother turned to look at me. Cormac turned to look at me. Felicity's mouth was open slightly. I looked at the hostess and said thank you. Then I looked at my mother, just for a moment, just long enough, and I said, "You can join me at my table if you'd like. There's room." Then I walked in. Here is what I know now that I didn't know then. People who have spent decades making you small don't suddenly have the vocabulary to make you large. You have to stop waiting for it. You have to decide on your own in a parking garage off Spark Street on a cold March night that you are going to walk into that room as yourself. Not as someone's difficult daughter, not as a +1, not as the family cash machine, just as yourself, and see what happens. My mother found my table about 20 minutes later. She sat down across from me, and she didn't say anything for a long time. The dinner service had started, and she was looking at the centerpiece, and I could see her doing the mental arithmetic she always did, trying to figure out how to reconfigure what she'd just learned into a story that made sense to her. Finally, she said, "You could have told me. Told you what? All of this. That you were involved with the foundation, that you were going to be here. You didn't ask," I said. "You've never asked." She looked at me then, really looked at me. I think it might have been the first time in years. "That's not fair," she said. "Mom," I put my fork down. "I have been sending you money for 6 years. I paid for the furnace and Cormac's truck and your knee surgery, and I've paid for things I've long since forgotten. And when I stopped for 1 month, you didn't speak to me for 3 weeks. And tonight you introduced me to a stranger as your plus one, while standing in a room where my name is on a donor wall." She looked at the table. There was a long pause. "I didn't know about the wall," she said. "You never asked," I said again. Cormac materialized at my elbow at some point. He'd been circling, I could tell, and he put a hand on my shoulder and said something jovial, some effort to lighten the mood, the way he always did when reality became inconvenient. I looked at his hand on my shoulder and he took it away. "I'm not angry," I told them both, and I meant it. "But I'm done." "Done with what?" Cormac said, "Done covering gaps. Done being the family emergency fund. Done being the person you call when something breaks, and the person you introduce as just a guest when something goes well." Felicity had appeared now too, hovering near Cormac's right shoulder. Bea was at home with a sitter, which I was grateful for. I didn't want Bea anywhere near this conversation. "You're going to stop helping us?" my mother said. And her voice had that edge in it, the one that used to make me fold immediately, the one that sounded like disappointment made audible. "I'm going to stop giving you money without limits," I said. "That's different from stopping caring about you. But those things got confused somewhere along the way, and I need to unconfuse them." My mother didn't say anything. The gala dinner went on around us. Somewhere across the room, a string quartet played something I didn't recognize. The chair of the foundation stood up and gave a speech and mentioned the names of the major donors, and when he said my name, my mother looked at the table. Later, when the dessert course came, she reached across and briefly touched my hand. She didn't say anything. I didn't say anything either. It wasn't forgiveness, and it wasn't a resolution. It was just two people who had run out of other options, sitting in the same room, eating the same dessert, trying to figure out what came next. What came next took a long time. I'm not going to pretend it resolved cleanly, because it didn't. The money transfers stopped, completely, that month and every month after. Cormac called twice in the first 6 weeks. The first call was to ask if I was okay, which I appreciated even though I suspected it was reconnaissance. The second call was to ask if I could help with something for Bea's school, a fee for a program, and I said yes to that one, directly to the school, because Bea had nothing to do with any of this, and I was never going to punish her for her parents. My mother and I talked on the phone about once a month. The calls were shorter than they used to be. She asked about work occasionally, which she had never done before. I answered. Sometimes she listened. It was something. 6 months after the gala, I got a card in the mail. Her handwriting on the envelope, which I recognized immediately because she wrote her sevens with a little crossbar the way Europeans do, a habit she'd picked up from somewhere I never knew. Inside was a birthday card. My birthday was still 3 weeks away, which meant she'd planned ahead, which she'd never done before. She'd written, "I have been thinking about what you said. I think I owe you more than I've given you. I'm not sure I know how to change, but I would like to try." I put the card on my fridge, under the magnet from a conference I'd gone to in Montreal. I cried a little, not because everything was fixed, nothing was fixed, but because she had used the word try, and in 63 years of living, I had never once heard my mother use that word about herself. A few weeks ago, a resident I'm supervising stopped me in the hallway after a morning teaching round. She's a second-year surgical resident, smart, a little relentless, the kind who reminds me of myself at that age. She said, "Dr. Ellison, can I ask you something personal?" I said, "Sure." She said, "Do you ever feel like you have to prove yourself more than the men on the service? Like you have to work twice as hard for the same amount of respect?" I thought about that for a minute. I thought about the Rideau Club. I thought about all the years I spent making myself easier to overlook, pouring energy into people who didn't see me, keeping myself small enough to fit into a role someone else had decided was mine. "Yes," I said. "I did, for a long time." She waited. "And then one day I stopped working for their version of me," I said, "and started working for my own. And it turned out that was the one I was actually good at." She nodded. She went back to her charts. I walked back to my office and thought about my mother and the card on my fridge and the gold-edged donor plaque in the lobby of the Rideau Club that has my name on it, which I walked past once, in February, on my way to a meeting, and stood in front of for about 30 seconds. Just long enough to read it. Just long enough to know it was real. I have never told my mother it exists. Some things I've decided are allowed to be just mine.